The night Montecito stopped feeling like home didn't start with shouting. It started with silence. Silence so loud it pressed against the walls. Silence that made every footstep echo. Silence that made one question impossible to ignore. What if the life you escaped halfway across the world to build was never really yours? But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. For years, Montecito was sold as the final chapter, the peaceful ending. The place where Prince Harry could finally exhale. No palace courtiers. No rigid traditions. No watching eyes. Just love, freedom, and a carefully curated sense of calm behind iron gates and manicured hedges. That was the image. But here's the uncomfortable truth most people missed. Fairy tales don't collapse overnight. They rot quietly first. Think about it. When was the last time Harry and Meghan looked unscripted together? Not smiling for cameras. Not delivering speeches. Not holding hands like punctuation marks in a press release. When was the last time they looked real? Because behind those gates, something was shifting. Subtly at first. Missed dinners. Locked doors. Conversations that stopped when footsteps approached. Staff coming and going faster than explanations could keep up with. And Harry, once so eager to protect the story, started noticing the cracks. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. The warning signs didn't come from tabloids. They didn't come from royal insiders. They didn't come from a phone hack or a leaked email. They came from patterns, from behavior, from someone who had always been there, long before Harry ever arrived. Ask yourself this. How well do you really know the people who were in your partner's life before you? There was one name that kept resurfacing. Always nearby. Always trusted. Always dismissed as harmless. A man who moved freely through Meghan's world, even as others were kept at arm's length. A man who knew her before titles, before deals, before Montecito became a headline. And Harry? He ignored it. Because that's what you do when you're trying to prove something. When you've burned bridges behind you and can't afford to admit the house you built might be unstable. Here's the contradiction no one likes to talk about. The man who walked away from the monarchy to escape control slowly realized he had lost control somewhere else entirely. Was it paranoia? Or was it intuition finally catching up? The tension wasn't explosive. It was cold, calculated, quiet. And that made it worse. Because quiet betrayals don't announce themselves. They wait. They let you connect the dots on your own. And once you do, you can never unsee the picture. Harry didn't confront her right away. That's the part that matters. He watched. He waited. He listened. Because when the truth finally surfaced, it wasn't just about infidelity. It was about loyalty. About power. About realizing the person you defended the loudest may have been rewriting the story behind your back. And the moment Harry finally saw what he wasn't supposed to see, he didn't raise his voice. He made a decision. But what happened next inside that Montecito mansion would fracture everything, and the name behind it would shock even the people closest to them. People assume betrayal announces itself with chaos. Raised voices. Slamming doors. Tears on the floor. That's not how this one unfolded. It crept in through routine. Through moments that felt too normal to question at first. A late-night meeting that ran long. A phone call that ended the moment Harry walked into the room. A smile that arrived half a second too late. Small things. Easy to dismiss. Dangerous to ignore. Here's the question no one asked out loud at the time. Why did the Montecito house suddenly feel divided, even when both of them were home? Harry had lived his entire life surrounded by handlers, aides, security teams, and palace whispers. He knew what secrecy looked like. He knew the difference between privacy and concealment. And something about the energy inside that house began to feel familiar in the worst way possible. It wasn't just emotional distance. It was strategic distance. Meghan's world started operating on a different schedule, different rhythms, meetings that didn't include him, decisions he learned about after they were already made, people he was told not to worry about, especially one. Ask yourself this. When someone is truly harmless, do you need to keep explaining why they're harmless? This wasn't a new presence. That's what made it harder to process. This was someone who had always been there. Someone woven into the fabric of Meghan's life long before Harry ever entered the picture. Trusted, defended, untouchable. Harry told himself it was nothing. He had to. Because admitting otherwise meant questioning the foundation of everything he'd sacrificed. Family, country, identity. You don't do that lightly. You don't do that unless the evidence forces you to. But the contradictions kept piling up. Why were conversations happening behind closed doors that used to be open? Why did staff suddenly seem uncomfortable, avoiding eye contact, choosing words carefully? Why did certain topics instantly shut down the room? Here's where the irony sharpens. The man accused for years of being paranoid, unstable, overly sensitive, was the only one paying attention. And the more he observed, the clearer the pattern became. This wasn't chaos. It was coordination. There's a moment in every unraveling where denial stops working, where you realize the problem isn't what you're seeing. It's how long you've been pretending not to see it. Harry didn't lash out. He didn't demand answers. He didn't play the jealous husband. Instead, he did something far more dangerous. He stayed quiet. He let routines continue. He let assumptions breathe. He gave space for mistakes to be made. Because when people think you're not watching, they get careless. And carelessness leaves trails. Late nights turned into unexplained absences. Private conversations turned into locked devices. Casual mentions turned into defensiveness. The cracks were no longer subtle. They were structural. Here's the chilling part. The proof didn't arrive as a confession. It arrived as something that was never meant for him. Something overlooked. Something assumed safe. And when Harry finally connected the last, it wasn't anger that hit him first. It was clarity. Because in that moment, he didn't just realize something was happening. He realized how long it had been happening, and who had been standing at the center of it all. But the most devastating part wasn't the betrayal itself. It was realizing the house he thought he controlled had never truly been his. And what Harry did with that realization would turn Montecito into a line in the sand no one could step back over. There's a moment after discovery that no one prepares you for. Not the explosion, not the confrontation, the stillness. That was the moment Harry found himself in, standing in a house that suddenly felt unfamiliar, like walking through a set after the cameras stopped rolling. Same furniture, same walls. Completely different meaning. Here's the uncomfortable question. What do you do when the truth doesn't arrive with drama, but with confirmation? Because that's what this was. Not suspicion anymore. Not intuition. Not whispers. Confirmation. It didn't come wrapped in scandal. It came through something mundane. Something routine. Something so ordinary it almost slipped past unnoticed. And that's what made it devastating. Because when betrayal hides in plain sight, it means it's been comfortable there for a long time. Harry didn't scream. He didn't confront anyone immediately. He sat with it. Let it sink in. Let the full weight of it press down on him. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had given up everything to protect this marriage. Defended it publicly. Burned bridges privately. And now he was staring at the realization that loyalty had never been mutual. Ask yourself this. Would you want the truth instantly? Or would you need time to understand how deep it went? Harry chose time. And in that time, something shifted inside him. The emotional fog cleared. The excuses stopped working. Every moment from the past began replaying itself through a different lens. The late nights. The unexplained absences. The sudden defensiveness when certain names came up. It all lined up. Too cleanly to ignore. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't impulsive. And it definitely wasn't new. The betrayal wasn't just physical or emotional. It was strategic. Calculated. Protected by familiarity and trust built long before Harry ever existed in that world. That's what hurt the most. Not just what was done, but how carefully it had been hidden. And here's the contradiction that stunned him. The more he stepped back, the clearer everything became. The chaos he had been accused of bringing into the marriage wasn't chaos at all. It was disruption. He had unknowingly disrupted a dynamic that predated him. That realization didn't break him. It hardened him. By the time Meghan realized something was wrong, the decision had already been made. Not out of rage, out of resolve. Because Harry understood something crucial in that moment. If he confronted her emotionally, the narrative would flip. If he reacted impulsively, he would lose control again. So he didn't. Instead, he did something no one expected. He drew a boundary so final it couldn't be negotiated. He made it clear, quietly and unmistakably, that Montecito was no longer shared ground. And that's when the shock set in. Because being asked to leave isn't just about space. It's about power. About who controls the story. About who moves first. And Harry moved first. No press statement. No public meltdown. No explanation. Just action. But the fallout didn't stop at the gates of that mansion. Because once Meghan stepped out of Montecito, the silence that followed spoke louder than any accusation ever could. And what happened in the hours after she left would ignite a battle far bigger than a marriage. One that no one outside that house was prepared for. When Meghan crossed the threshold of Montecito for the last time, there was no dramatic farewell. No raised voices echoing down the hallway. No witnesses standing by to leak details. Just distance. And sometimes, distance is louder than accusation. Here's the twist most people didn't see coming. Being asked to leave wasn't the end of the story. It was the opening move. Because in high-profile relationships, silence is an absence. It's positioning. Think about it. If this had been a heat-of-the-moment decision, there would have been chaos. Statements. Friends rushing to the press. Competing narratives fighting for oxygen. But instead, there was nothing. A vacuum. And vacuums pull attention toward them whether you want them to or not. Harry stayed quiet. And that silence did something unexpected. It flipped the power dynamic overnight. Suddenly, people started asking questions. Why weren't there denials? Why wasn't there a carefully worded statement blaming stress, pressure, misunderstanding? Why did Montecito feel sealed off, emotionally and literally? Because the absence of explanation forces imagination to work overtime. Friends began choosing sides without being asked. Allies grew cautious. Conversations that once flowed freely became guarded. And the media, trained to chase noise, didn't know what to do with restraint. Here's the irony that cuts the deepest. The man long painted as reactive, impulsive, and unstable had made the most controlled move of his life. He didn't beg. He didn't bargain. He didn't threaten. He simply removed access. And that's when the real panic set in. Because when someone stops arguing, it usually means they've already decided the outcome. Meghan's exit from Montecito wasn't framed publicly as exile. But behind the scenes, it landed like one. Access to the home meant access to influence, to proximity, to control over optics. Losing that meant losing leverage. And in a world built on narrative, leverage is everything. Ask yourself this. If you believed you still held the upper hand, would you rush to explain yourself? Or would you wait? The waiting became the message. No photos. No smiling appearances. No carefully staged togetherness. Just separation. And the longer the silence stretched, the more damaging it became. Because people don't fear accusations as much as they fear unanswered questions. And those questions were multiplying. What exactly did Harry see? How long had he known? And why was he so confident walking away without a public fight? The most unsettling part wasn't that Meghan was gone from Montecito. It was that Harry didn't seem to chase her back. That single detail shattered the illusion that this was temporary. Or reparable. Because when a man who has spent his entire life fighting to hold on to people finally lets go without noise, it means something fundamental has shifted. And the truth is, what hasn't surfaced publicly yet may be the most explosive piece of all. Because silence isn't just strategy. Sometimes it's a countdown. And when that countdown ends, the story won't be about who left Montecito. It will be about what Harry decides to reveal next. It started with a question, and it ends with one too. What happens when the story you defended becomes the story you walk away from? Montecito was supposed to be the final destination. The place where Harry rewrote his life on his own terms. No crown. No courtiers. No inherited script. Just autonomy, love, and a future he believed he chose freely. But here's the uncomfortable truth that lingers long after the gates closed. Freedom doesn't mean safety. And escaping one system doesn't protect you from building another. When Harry chose silence instead of spectacle, he did something rare in a world addicted to noise. He refused to explain himself. He refused to rush the narrative. He refused to give anyone the satisfaction of watching him unravel in public. And that refusal became the loudest statement of all. Because silence forces reflection. It invites scrutiny. It turns attention inward. And for the first time in a long time, the spotlight wasn't on what Harry had done wrong. It was on what had been happening around him. Think about how this story would have played out if he had reacted differently. A shouting match. A dramatic leak. A carefully curated victim narrative. That's what everyone expected. That's what would have been easy. Instead, he walked away. Not from the cameras. From the dynamic. And that's why this moment matters. This wasn't just about infidelity or betrayal. It was about agency. About realizing too late that loyalty had been one-sided and choosing not to negotiate with it anymore. About understanding that some relationships don't end with explosions. They end with doors quietly closing. Here's the contradiction that will stay with people long after the headlines fade. The man accused of being controlled finally took control, not by force, but by removal. No Montecito, no shared space, no shared illusion. And yet, this isn't a clean ending. It never is. Because the questions haven't gone away. They've only grown sharper. What exactly did Harry see that made him so certain? Why is he so comfortable letting the silence speak for him? And what happens when the truth he's been sitting on finally surfaces? If it surfaces, that's the part that should make everyone pause. Because silence isn't just restraint. It's leverage. And leverage is only useful when you're prepared to use it. So now the story hangs in an uneasy balance. Between what's been revealed and what's still being withheld. Between the narrative people assume and the reality that hasn't been confirmed. And you, watching this unfold, have to decide something for yourself. Do you believe silence is an admission of defeat or a sign that the final move hasn't been made yet? If you've made it this far, you already know this story isn't over. Not by a long shot. And when the next chapter breaks, it won't come with a warning. So if you want to stay ahead of what comes next, make sure you're subscribed, drop your thoughts in the comments, and tell me this. Was Montecito the beginning of Harry's freedom, or just the place where he finally saw the truth? Because what he does next may change everything.